Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about today, best practices for testing mobile Android applications. A lot of what we're going to talk about here can apply to other platforms as well, but I have tried to center it towards Android in some degrees when it comes to tools and various techniques you can use and gotchas that you have to watch out for. So what we're going to cover, we're going to talk about the challenges that come with testing mobile applications in general, the importance of knowing the app you're testing, some types of testing. We're going to briefly go into an introduction of the Google SDK tools that are included with the Android SDK that can help in testing as well as development. We'll talk about some other tools and resources that can help you in your testing efforts. We'll have a couple demos in there of those two, quick little demos. I'll show you some tools that we have used in our testing. And then we'll just wrap up with some helpful things to remember, some hints in general about when you're testing. Okay. So one thing to let you guys know, please stop me at any time for questions. I don't mind. A lot of times I'm on a particular slide, I'll be in a particular mindset, so the best time to get me to answer the question is right then because I'm thinking more about it. Or if you choose to save until the end, that's fine as well. So we're going to start with challenges of testing Android applications. Okay, so and this is true of mobile applications as well, general mobile applications, whether it be iOS, Android, Windows Phone 7, Symbian, any of the major platforms that are out there. So there's a lot of similarities to desktop application testing, what we might call traditional application testing, but there's also some differences or things you need to be aware of. Some of the big high-level things is generally with mobile devices you have limited access to the operating system. Okay, we're all used to on Windows platforms how you can go in and basically do almost anything you want, right? You can install any type of software, you can do scripting, you can access the low-level features of the operating system or the memory or the hard disk or whatever you want to do, right? There's virtually nothing you can't do when you're working on a typical desktop, laptop, PC. Mobile applications, you have some control, but not as much. From a security perspective, a lot of that is locked down. Now, once we get into the whole idea of rooting devices, jailbreaking, that opens up more options. But traditionally speaking, if you're testing mobile applications, it's not always good to test on rooted or jailbroken devices because a large portion of people aren't going to be. Right? So you tend to want to test with applications that are in the same state as the end users who will eventually have your application will be. Updates to third-party apps are much more frequent and harder to control with mobile applications, right? In days of PCs, especially in the corporate world, companies would use SMS or Tivoli, some other mechanism for deploying applications to their PCs, and they would control when the updates come out, right? A company could wrap enterprise applications up, push them out to the device, and then decide when, if, and where they're going to deploy an update. In the mobile world, that's very hard to control because generally applications, for the most part, come from the marketplace. And the marketplace automatically notifies the user when there's updates available when they open the marketplace or whatever. So you can't always assume that all your end users are running the same versions of the applications. Okay. Also, with mobile, there's bigger performance concerns. In the desktop world, I consider there to be three pillars of performance customers are concerned about: CPU usage, memory usage, and boot time. How does your application affect the boot time? Many applications it won't affect it at all, but if you're running some sort of security or service-based application, it can impact the boot time of your device. Two of those apply to the mobile world as well, memory and CPU. But there's a third, which I believe is the biggest that you have to be worried about, which is battery utilization. Okay, that's the number one thing in my opinion that can make a user uninstall your software and never look at it again. If a user puts your app on their device and they believe, and notice I say they believe because it may or may not, that your application is negatively impacting the battery of their device, they're very likely to uninstall it and not give you a second chance. So got to be very mindful of that. Another similarity is fragmentation. This is an Android buzzword, right? Everyone associates it with Android. Software and hardware fragmentation, not only based on versions of the operating system, but also on different types of hardware, right? Different vendors. When we're done here and people get a chance to look at the top, we have a collection of phones representing from like the last 4 years of Android that up here, and you'll see all the differences, right? You have devices with GPS, without GPS. You have some that support keyboards, some that may have NFC, near-field communications. Some of the older ones had an actual, like trackball you could use to navigate around the phone, right? Not common anymore, but are you going to support that in your app for the small percentage of people who still have it, right? So there's all types of things to think about with fragmentation. We will spend a little time going into detail on that, both in the second presentation that we'll do later on the 10 Mysteries of Android. And there's a limited number of tools to help. It's getting better. There are companies working to develop more tools. I know the last time I've done a heavy review of what automation tools were available was about 6 months ago. I've recently become aware of some new tools that are out there that I'm in the process of starting evaluation on. But as far as automation and test tools go for the mobile world, it's very much in its infancy. Okay, there are some built into the OS. iOS has some profiling tools built into Xcode, which can be very helpful. At the development stages, aren't as helpful at the QA stages unless it's the developer QAing the app, right? Which one of the rules of software development is that you should never test your own app. I actually say you should test your own app. You should be the only person who tests your app. So the tools are getting better, but the challenge is that, there's not a lot of cohesive tools that go across multiple platforms or that work really well. The fragmentation makes that a little tougher. I'll talk a little bit when we talk about tools a little more later on about some of my experience with evaluating tools and all. Give you an idea of what's going on. Okay, so when you're going to test an application, it's very important that you're familiar and understanding as much as you can about the application as you're testing, okay? So there's basically 3 types of applications you could be testing. One, you could be testing an application you wrote yourself, right? It's your app, you need to test it. You could be testing an application that someone else in your company wrote, if you work for a company and you're part of the testing team, okay? Or you could be testing another vendor's app, right? Maybe your company is deciding which, third-party email solution they want to adopt in their company, and they have you testing all the different email solutions in the marketplace. Or maybe they're looking into some sort of a PDF reader, and they want to know what the best PDF reader is. So they have you evaluating. So again, those are applications that are developed outside your company that you have less insight into. So when you're testing your own apps, you want to start testing early and often, right? I mean, this is common even from traditional software testing logic. It's much easier to fix the issues when in the development stage than once code is complete, right? You have a distinct advantage of knowing exactly what your app does and how it works. Okay, you know the code, you wrote it, you know where your paths are, and make sure you're kind of tracing through it. And always have someone else test it. If you test your own app, there's going to be things you take for granted, especially in usability. We all tend to develop our applications, especially in small teams, around how we envision we would use them, right? Get some outside people, whether friends, family, crowdsourced testing, which we'll talk about a little bit later, anything you can to get some more input on your app. People always try things you don't think of, okay? If you're testing your company's apps and you're on the QA team, get involved with the developers early on. Know what they're working on, know what they're doing, know what features are coming in. Make sure the developers are using the tools they have available to test their apps. So whatever profiling tools are there, ask them what they're showing, right? Ask them what the areas of concern are, what areas you should focus on. Other things you should check is don't wait for the whole app to be code complete before you start testing it. If you can get a drop of an app that has 1 or 2 features ready, going, able to be tested, go ahead and get it and start testing those things. Again, find the issues early, right? So that they're easier to fix. When you're talking about other vendors' apps, the keys need to be a little different. Not only do you need to do the regular testing, but you also need to know whose app this is you're testing, right? Make sure you research the vendor. Do they have a support team? How often do they put out updates? Do they respond to bug fixes? Right? Because if you decide to QA and test an application and roll it out to 5,000 users in your company, and then suddenly a major bug is found and the company's unresponsive and not fixing bugs in their app anymore and have dropped it entirely, well then you now have to come up with a new solution and redeploy to 5,000 people, right? So, again, do some research on who the company is. I'm not saying you can't, find the next Mark Zuckerberg coding an app, that's going to be perfect or whatever, but do some sort of checks to see that you're going to be able to talk to this guy. Read the user feedback in the marketplace, but don't take it at face value, okay? People marketplace only put negative. It's a lot harder to get people who put positive spins, especially if you're doing a business level app or a corporate level app. something that most users probably wouldn't, say I really want, right? It's different when a game, oh, it's a great game, right? No one's going to say, oh, this is a great app that lets my company control my phone, that type of thing. So, use the feedback, check the vendor, how many versions have they released, what's the history of the bugs, check the company website, what other applications, how long they've been in the business. It's a combination of things. Just know who it is and how you get support if you need it on the application. Okay? All right. More on knowing the application you're testing. So the next thing, especially for Android, is you have to know what platforms and OS versions are you planning to support your app on. Okay? So there's two main things with Android. One is the Android OS version, 1X, 2X, 3X, and 4X. I would encourage no one to develop really on 1X anymore. It's less. It's probably close to 5% now. 2, 3, and 4, all worthwhile versions, still widely deployed. And are you going to support tablet or smartphones? Okay. The user experience on the tablet is much different than the user experience on a smartphone. A good developer will develop separate interfaces for tablet versus smartphone to take advantage of the additional real estate. Now, when you compare Android to iOS, things get a little complex because on iOS you have two options. You either have the standard smartphone size or you have the iPad size, right? With Android, you have a lot of in between. So you not only have the phones, which are 3 or 4 inches, then you have the large tablets, which are 9 and 10, the mid-range tablets, which are 7, and then you have these newer devices like the Samsung Galaxy Note, which are kind of like 5-inch screens and don't know what they want to be, right? Are they a tablet or are they a smartphone? There are various ways that developers can choose how to develop, a tablet versus a smartphone interface. But, one of the things you want to check is if you are developing it for a tablet, the interface on a smartphone may not take proper advantage of the tablet. So, again, that's something that applies a lot during the design and development phase. But during the QA phase, it's good to keep that in mind as well. Okay. Are there any feature requirements of the application? This is very important. I've encountered multiple issues on this. If you download an application and going to install it on an Android device, it'll tell you usually what it needs access to, what features of the phone, both security and hardware-wise, GPS, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, accelerometer, touchscreen. There were some old phones that didn't have touchscreen. Not really much anymore. You need to know from two things, from a support and a performance perspective. One of the important things to keep in mind is that I've seen people bring a device to me and say, hey, I can't see this application in the workspace, right, in the marketplace. It's not showing up when I search for it to download for my device. And the reason was that the developer coded Bluetooth as required instead of optional, right? So if the developer codes Bluetooth as required on an Android app and the device accessing the marketplace doesn't support Bluetooth, it won't show up in the search list. So have to do some troubleshooting. And although Bluetooth was used by the app, it wasn't mandatory. It was just that the application had the ability to turn Bluetooth on and on, off and on. Well, if it doesn't have the device, it just won't access it. But because it was put as a required element on the device, you've now eliminated a large percentage of the potential marketplace from looking at the device. So often, quality assurance job is to check these types of things. We're not checking only code, we're checking packaging and requirements to say, hey, are you guys aware that this can't be installed on a device that doesn't support Bluetooth? Chances are someone's going to say, no, that's a very small part of our app. It doesn't affect it whatsoever. It's just, something we coded as an extra feature. Know that type of stuff. Be aware. Okay? And then finally, are there any permission requirements? Okay? Does the application need to access your contact list, access your phone, access your SMS messaging, right? Be aware that some people, to a degree, rightfully so, can be over-paranoid. Right, and say, wait a minute, this application wants to access my contact list? Why? Right? It's a little news app. Why does it want my contact list? Is it going to spam my people? That's one thing I like about Android is when you install an application, it tells you all the things it's going to have access to. Right? Problem is, most people just hit next and go and don't read it. If you read that list, you'll know. Okay, what's there? Actually, I've seen some of the later phones and all. They really do a good job of fleshing out what that right means. This means, to the point where it actually says this means that a bad application could access your contact list and send spam, right? So know what your application's doing. If your application's requiring a permission that it doesn't really need, right, or that's a minor feature that can be done a different way, you should report that. You should note that in your testing. hey, we're accessing the SMS feature, but we're only using it for one thing in the phone. Should we consider not using that? It's perfectly valid to consider that, to understand and know, what's your application's doing to appease users who may be concerned about those types of things.